way of thinking about it. And that's one of the main reasons we have to work with computer scientists. I should say we get to work with computer scientists, because we couldn't do what we do without them. Next slide. They can give us some pretty cool metrics and eye candy as we go through this thing. This little graph here, the top graph, shows composite difficulty. We're looking at one of the many things we're studying is how tough tasks are and how different groups are effective at solving some tasks and failing at others. And when you do that, you want to make sure you understand how tough the different tasks are. And usually it comes down to, well, I was killing a monster. Well, what level was the monster? And what we found out was that the difficulty shows up in this top series up here with these little spikes here. And we couldn't figure out why that was. And we talked to Sony and they said, oh, well, there's a main difficulty level, and then there's a whole other variable that's a secondary difficulty level where we break it down into another series of 10 difficulty points. But the players never see that. And we're like, oh, wow, we didn't know that. And when we zoom in on the graph, you can see that the difficulty for attacking monsters actually kind of looks like this. It's this weird periodic effect. And so when we're trying to do something to measure a group outcome, we actually have to use this kind of metric as a control. Well, how tough was the task? Well, a task at level 62, 63, 64, 65, they aren't incremental. If you could see it, like the 65 has a peak and the 62 is really low, we have to be able to account for that. And so that's one of the things that the computer science folks allowed us to do, is to go in and empirically look at how tough these tests were and how often people succeeded at them. And that's what this graph shows you. That's the very short version of it. Next slide. Another task that the CS folks gave us or helped us solve was just, how well do people behave? And frankly, this formula at the bottom terrifies me. I'm not entirely sure what's in it, but my computer science colleagues assure me that it's all very important, and it combines all these factors of the intensity of the task at hand and the size of the group and the composition of the group that is tackling it, and it spits out a number which says the performance is X, which is nice. So to do this and to calculate this, they have to sift through several million rows for every single entry, every single player. So it's pretty computationally intensive. Next slide. All right, so some basic findings. Here are some of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, from the study. The very first thing we did was just to look through the survey data to find out who's playing, why they're playing, just some basic stuff. And then to tie it in with the easiest in-game metric, which is just simple playing time. So I'll walk you through some of these things. Again, this is kind of a tip of the iceberg approach. Almost all these slides, like every couple slides, is a paper. So if you want more, let me know. The first thing that we found out, which is it's not surprising to those of us working in the space, is that these people playing this particular game, again, this generalizability question, aren't particularly young. They're actually fairly close to the U.S. population. The average age of a player is 31 years old. You can see the U.S. population median is 35. And there are, in fact, more players in their 30s than there are in their 20s. So this is pretty counter to the stereotype of games as exclusively the province of young boys or young socially isolated awkward boys in basements. They might be older, socially awkward, isolated men, but they are certainly not the stereotype you might think. And so you can see on the right there, that table, the percentage of people in different groups. It's a pretty almost normal distribution. If you look at there are a few people in their teens and a few people in their 50s and older, and there's a big clump of folks right in the middle in their 30s. So that's the mass appeal. It's possible that this game skews differently. The anecdotal evidence from Warcraft, which is the big market leader, suggests to me that it might run younger than this, but as with almost all these findings, we don't know, because this is the only study that does this stuff. So everybody else is kind of mystery. Next slide. So here's an interesting one. How much do they play? Well, the first thing is the mean number of hours played per week is almost 26 hours a week, where I can't see your reactions and we're not close there, but almost every audience that ever said that to me is like, oh my God, 26 hours a week, what are these people doing? And so I always have to point out, well, the average number of hours people are watching in a household in the U.S., depending on the study you look at, is somewhere between like 25 and the low 30s, which you divide by 7 in the course of a week means people are watching television for 4, 5, 6 hours a week on average at home. So suddenly that number isn't quite as high when you look at it in relation. And so, okay, does that number add on to or displace existing screen time? We can't test that in this specific study, but in the work I did in my dissertation, I had an experimental design, and what I found was when people played an MMO, the time came almost exclusively from prior existing entertainment consumption. So what they did was they stopped watching TV. They didn't go out to the movies as much. And when the TV that they stopped watching was almost always the entertainment TV, they kept their news consumption the same, but they would cut down on sports and drama and fiction. And so it's really a substitute of one form of entertainment for another. And the number of screen hours in total is probably about the same. Maybe slightly higher for the players, but not dramatically so. There certainly isn't an additional effect. So who's playing all these hours? And the graph on the right here, the hours played per week, if you look at it and just kind of roughly eyeball it and realize these are age brackets, you'll see there's a basic rise from left to right, where the people under 18 years of age are playing about 22 hours a week, and you get up to the people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they're approaching almost 30 hours a week or slightly higher. So there's an upward trend, and in fact, it's directly counter to my assumption about young people having more free time. The exact opposite is true. It's the older people who play the most. And I can speculate about this. I think there are strong social reasons for this, but feel free to bring it up in Q&A if you're interested in this finding. But anyway, so much for the idea that it's kids with free time. Kids apparently are busier than we thought. Next slide. So everybody likes the odd, weird, fun findings. So here are just some random things that showed up in the survey data, most of which were kind of surprising. The big weird one was that the players appear to be healthier, in that we asked them their height and their weight, and this lets us calculate their BMI and to contrast those figures with the U.S. population. It's not to say that the players are healthy. In fact, the U.S. population is morbidly obese, and so no one's healthy. What you could say is these players are less unhealthy than typical Americans. A lot of interesting reasons why that might be. Again, we could speculate about that afterwards. I had a lot of fun talking with reporters about this one lately. I think this reason has more to do with the TV they stopped watching than it does with the games they are still playing. But they did have slightly different attitudes towards exercise. They're a little more vigorous than the non-players are. Again, something we can bring up and talk about later if you like. As far as mental indicators, it's kind of a mixed bag. They're a little more depressed, but a little less anxious compared to the U.S. population. So if you think of those things as equally bad, it's kind of a split decision there. The healthiest single group appears to be the older women, and there's a really interesting series of findings on women, which I'm going to get into in a minute. The women turned out to be the more intense players in terms of time and commitment. They're the ones, even though they're a smaller segment of the player base, they play differently than the men, and they tend to be older. There are a couple weird findings. They're more likely to be disabled, and they are really high levels of bisexuality. It's not something I went in looking for, but some data points just stick out. The number is, as you can see, 14 versus 3% for the U.S. population. It's a pretty big spike of difference, and they're also twice as likely to be physically impaired. So that suggests that it's not necessarily mainstream women or women in the social or physical or psychological norms, perhaps. And so we can speculate about why those populations might be drawn to such a game. Next slide. So with that in mind, we did a specific test on gender. We're interested in applications of gender role theory, which is to say that our assumption is that boys and girls are, of course, biologically different, but are certainly also, on top of that, socialized early on into certain gender expectations and behavioral norms where, depending on whose theory you buy, the boys are pushed away and told to be more independent and develop more of a strong, isolated personality, and the girls are kept sort of more in the nest and pushed to be more socializers and more nurturing and spending more time with their mother. The theory is that is part of what predicts behaviors later on in life, and that leads to gender normative behaviors later on. And if that's the case, we should expect those patterns to bear out in the way they play, how they think about it, what's going on. And certainly there's a big push for men to be more involved with technology for very strong social reasons, to get the boy inventor stereotype. And so, of course, we're not particularly shocked to see that a game made by men for men with male themes tracks the genders at an 80-20 split. The player population is 80% male and 20% female. However, next slide. The women, as I mentioned, are the hardcore players. Not only are they